talk to you today a little bit about the origins of the report that you'll have seen, the free MAT report, and where the idea for it came from. I've been working now with Arbor for quite a few years on these free reports, and this year's reports have had a little bit of a shift in focus. I want to talk about that and the thinking behind that approach. And it kind of comes from three insights, which are quite obvious insights, but the question of how they interact with each other is a lot less obvious. So firstly, the fact that school context varies, that this is linked to outcomes, and that when you look at different MATs, they've got very different strategies and very different operations. And there's a big question about how each of those things works together. And the idea that kind of drove the shaping of the report this year was about what kind of information can we provide that is going to help people to explore that link and to understand it and make informed decisions that are a lot more nuanced than might be from some of the more traditional approaches to just benchmarking schools. So I'm going to talk through those 3 points today, and the sort of story about how I became so interested in those three areas. But perhaps then, to set out where that kind of story starts, to introduce myself. I've been in the education and youth sector for nearly 20 years, starting off as a youth worker in Cambridge, so in a slightly different part of the sector. And then I moved into schools. I taught in northwest London at St George's School in near Maida Vale. And then just over 10 years ago, I moved out of schools and set up the Centre for Education and Youth, which is about kind of bridging those two worlds of the education and youth sector, but also about informing what goes on in schools better through research and better understanding of policy, whilst in the other direction, informing policymakers much more using proper research and insight from what's going on in schools. So that kind of background is why I became quite geekily interested in a lot of the questions that have shaped this report. And the first part of the origins of this report start in around 2012, I think, when someone who some of you may remember, Chris Cook, who was at the time the education editor at the Financial Times, started doing a lot of research on variation in school performance by region. And he really cast the light on the high performance of London schools, which is something I became really interested in. And in 2014, I published a big report called Lessons from London Schools, looking at why London schools were doing so well and trying to unpick all the different factors behind that. But after that came out, we actually realized that we'd massively underestimated a lot of the contextual factors that were impacting on London schools. So we realized that a lot of those contextual questions that are flagged in the MAT report, the Arbor MAT report, were actually much more important than we'd realized at the time. So perhaps in a sort of subconscious effort to try and compensate for having underestimated that the first time, I then started to do more and more research on this question. And I became really interested in this data set that you will see referred to in the MAT report that looks at area types. So, for example, I did this comparison looking at Kingston upon Hull and Kingston upon Thames, and looking at what was different about those areas and how that linked to educational achievement. And I started spending a lot of time with these maps of different areas of the country and really granular data about who was living there and what that meant for achievement. And if you look at those different areas, and these are actually the broadest categories in that data set, there's actually far more granular data in there. If you look at these top area types, you can see that they vary hugely when it comes to FSM and when it comes to attainment. But the interesting thing I noticed when I looked at this table was the fact that if you look at the two most highly performing areas, the area types, the affluent England and London cosmopolitan, yet they're actually the areas with the most contrasting FSM levels. So that made me think what we needed was a much more sophisticated exploration of context than just looking at the usual single continuum of deprivation level. Because when I then plotted these things out into this very colourful, quite exciting graph, but somewhat difficult to read one, and I looked at the relationship between educational achievement and disadvantage in different areas, and saw that the patterns were completely different depending on the area type, because these area types are so much more sophisticated in terms of characterizing a school or a maths context. And it struck me that this was really useful information for school leaders, because it helped them to understand the particular characteristics of their area and some of the things they might need to respond to. And that's where we saw that actually the relationship between deprivation and school achievement is completely different in those different area types. And it was really exciting to get an opportunity to put that information into the reports that have then gone to so many different maths. So that I'm going to call the sort of chapter 1 of my interest in this area and the origins of this report. The second one is another report I authored a couple of years ago with Ambition School Leadership, now the Ambition Institute. And this one was looking at MAT leadership and operations. And we started off that report with a hypothesis that different MATs had a different vision, and that they therefore had to develop a strategy to achieve that vision, and that would then shape their operations, and that their operations would be more or less centralized depending on what they were trying to achieve. But what we found once we actually started our analysis, which involved surveying, I think, about 25 different MATs and interviewing, I think, 44 MAT chief execs. So we may well have interviewed some of you over the course of that. And we looked at that information and we realized that actually it wasn't just a case of, again, one continuum in terms of centralization. There were different things that different MATs centralized. And that was often quite a pragmatic decision based on the context, how fast the MAT had grown, how varied the schools within that MAT were. And that was constantly changing. So MATs were hitting these breakpoints as they grew. And that meant that their strategy needed to change, or their operations needed to change, and that they might want to centralize different things at different times. So again, you'll see that the report that you've all had from Arbor tries to help with some of that by understanding what is the difference between the schools within a MAT and how is it changing. And that can tie into then what we found about the different strategies. We looked at a whole different set of strategies that a MAT might choose to perform, and we found that they prioritized different types of strategies to different extents, depending on where they were at. So as you can see, there's basically these two different sides of my interest, and two different sides of things that I think are so important for leaders in schools to be thinking about. And that's why I was really keen to work with Arbor on this year's report in the way that it's come out, to provide that information and inform some of the conversations that need to go into the decisions about these types of strategies and the operational decisions that go with them. Because that actually can start to feed into how your particular approach to school improvement. And we set out in that report on MATs a set of 5 different school improvement models that were kind of best fit characterizations of the approaches MATs were taking, depending on their context. So I'll finish there. I've put some links to those reports if you want to find out a little bit more about them. But I'm also happy to chat about them if you want to contact me at any point. We can talk about it more, but obviously we've got time for questions now. So keen to hear what you think.
I'll jump in with one, Loic, before you take some from the crowd. With performance tables being abolished this year, what do you think? How do you think schools and MATs are going to or should benchmark themselves? That's a hard one.
Well, it's hard. I mean, I think that firstly, a single year's data is never the thing that should be making it your decision shouldn't be based on a single year's data anyway. I've long been campaigning for the use of multi-year measures in league tables. So I think that actually it's not that 1 year that's going to tell you. You should have the information about immediate trends and changes in that particular year from your own experience of your schools, your knowledge of them, and your internal data. So it's not necessarily external comparative data to other schools that you need on a single year basis in order to be able to make decisions. So I don't think people will necessarily be despairing about not having that information. And I think there's also opportunities for people to collaborate and make comparisons more informally. So I think it's it will very much change the way we're used to doing things, but I don't think it needs to really get in the way of the real meaningful stuff of school improvement.
And what do you think the opportunities are? It's a open playing field next year. You've done some really interesting work using like more nuanced benchmarks based on sort of different population types, for example. What are some of the other things that you think, like, now it's an open goal, well, open goal, but it's an open playing field. So what's some of the other things you've been thinking about and researching that schools could kind of draw on next year for benchmarking purposes?
Yeah, so well, beyond just benchmarking, actually, I mean, we're about to publish a report called Making Waves, which is about how schools and MATs are innovating in assessment and how they're going about experimenting and doing new things. And we're finding that actually lots of people are taking the initiative and developing new ways of assessing, really based on what is the information you want to know. So, you know, whether that be schools that are wanting to monitor the more well-being focused interventions by using something like Impact Ed, where they're looking at using metrics for wider skills and wider developmental outcomes and being able to benchmark those, or whether it's MATs we've seen who have developed really interesting models of cascading information all the way from the classroom level through kind of rich discussions with heads of year or heads of department, and then feeding that up in a much more action-focused conversation. So I think people will be looking to doing things in new ways that will be more directly tied to making decisions that can actually inform teaching.